The invisible pulse swept through darkness, cutting across the Pacific like a silent scream. By 1945, Japanese pilots flew into their final battles, knowing they had already been seen. Radar screens aboard American ships tracked every movement. Fighters vectored toward kamikaze attacks with deadly precision. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had shown the world what happened when one side could see everything. Japanese formations, carefully planned and courageously flown, were slaughtered before they reached their targets. Hundreds of planes fell like autumn leaves. American radar operators sat in darkened rooms, watching blips dance across glowing screens. They directed fighters with calm voices. Vector 270, Angels 15. Death came from directions pilots never saw. But this technological massacre had humble beginnings. Let's go back to where it all started. The birth of an invisible eye. In the 1920s, American researchers noticed something strange about radio waves. Signals bounced off solid objects, returning echoes that hinted at hidden presence. To most, it was a curiosity. To a few visionaries, it was the key to seeing the unseeable. The Naval Research Laboratory in Washington became ground zero for this revolution. Engineers experimented with crude systems that could detect aircraft miles away. The devices were massive, unstable, temperamental. Yet each breakthrough carried profound implications. A new kind of vision was being born. One that didn't depend on human eyesight or unreliable scouts. The term radar emerged as the technology matured: radio detection and ranging. Its essence was deceptively simple. A transmitter sent out pulses of radio energy. When that energy hit something, a ship, a plane, even a storm cloud, it reflected back. Sensitive receivers measured the time delay and strength of echoes. What had seemed invisible suddenly left signatures in the ether, clear as lights in darkness. The Navy embraced these possibilities eagerly. American strategists understood the vast Pacific distances. Traditional lookouts could never cover such space effectively. Eyes tired, weather obscured. Nightfall blinded even the sharpest seamen. Radar promised something different. A tireless watchman that could see through darkness and fog. By 1939, experimental sets were fitted onto select U.S. ships. These early models were cumbersome. Large antennas required constant calibration, but they offered glimpses of a revolutionary future. Fleets could maneuver with unseen guidance. Coastal installations stretched radar coverage along America's borders. The technology remained classified, spoken only in code, confined to restricted rooms filled with humming machinery. Most sailors had no idea such devices existed. For officers who knew, radar represented an entirely new dimension of warfare. Naval battles had traditionally depended on line of sight, flares, chance encounters. Now commanders could plot courses based on echoes detected over the horizon. They could anticipate enemy movements, track incoming bombers, direct fighters toward unseen targets. The concept was intoxicating. Its potential would remain untested until the Pacific erupted. When confidence ruled the waves. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a different philosophy dominated naval thinking. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of confidence. Admirals and strategists believed they possessed the most disciplined sailors, the most daring pilots, the most fearsome fleet of carriers the world had seen. Their doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and above all, surprise. A strike delivered with ruthless swiftness would overwhelm opponents before defenses could organize. The Japanese High Command saw themselves as inheritors of ancient warrior tradition, guardians of a modern industrial empire ready to crush Pacific resistance. Victory seemed to hinge on spirit, discipline, and initiative, not on technology they didn't understand. The Pacific Ocean was an immense stage where vision determined survival. Fleets that could see first had the chance to strike first. Japanese naval intelligence relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft, fast cruisers, networks of scouts scattered across island outposts, pilots trained to fly long distances over endless seas. They returned with observations that guided admirals in plotting maneuvers. This method seemed reliable. Early successes in China and the Pacific reinforced the idea. Human eyes, sharpened by discipline, were enough to control the ocean. American naval officers seemed clumsy to the Japanese, reliant on industrial output rather than razor-sharp tactical thinking. The Japanese emphasized warrior spirit, Bushido, as their secret weapon. Courage and sacrifice could tilt any battle in their favor. The possibility that unseen technology, operating silently and invisibly, might change detection at sea wasn't fully appreciated in Tokyo's naval academies. The Pacific remained a place where daring pilots and sharp-eyed lookouts defined war's outcome. Young pilots standing on flight decks in the late 1930s trusted their own senses. They practiced long-range navigation by stars and instinct. Mastery of nature and discipline of mind gave them their edge. The notion that invisible signals might betray their approach seemed supernatural, a violation of war's natural order. To them, the sky was vast and empty, the ocean endless. So long as they could outfly and outthink adversaries, victory appeared assured. The irony of scientific whispers. The irony was profound. By the mid-1930s, whispers of strange radio vision devices circulated among European and American scientific communities. Reports from Britain spoke of experiments detecting aircraft at great distances using invisible waves. In the United States, civilian scientists and military engineers imagined placing such devices on ships or along coasts. To the Japanese military, however, such rumors seemed abstract, almost fantastical. Their belief in traditional reconnaissance methods remained unshaken. They imagined that even if such machines existed, they'd be too bulky, too unreliable, too impractical for battle's heat. Japanese naval planners crafted elaborate war games. Battleships and carriers maneuvered across paper oceans. These exercises, staged with miniature fleets, emphasized surprise strikes against American bases like Pearl Harbor. Victory always came through stealth, deception, sudden force. The assumption behind all exercises was simple. The enemy would remain blind until too late. No chart, no orders considered the possibility. American ships might detect incoming squadrons far beyond the horizon, long before any lookout glimpsed specks in the sky. Japanese military culture held certain disdain for over-reliance on machines. Human determination was prized above technical contraptions. This attitude wasn't unique to Japan. Many navies initially underestimated radar's potential, but in Tokyo, cultural emphasis on spirit over circuitry created a blind spot. While American scientists labored quietly to refine radar, Japanese officers doubled down. Courage, endurance, and training would always outweigh gadgets. This confidence wasn't entirely misplaced initially. Japanese aviators shocked the world with surprise attack skills. Their ability to outmaneuver heavier opponents. Zero fighters, fast and agile, became symbols of aerial superiority. Carrier operations were precise and devastating. But beneath these triumphs lay a fatal assumption. The battlefield remained essentially visible and predictable. An unseen hand guiding defenders from miles away simply didn't fit their worldview. The morning that changed everything. December 7, 1941. The Hawaiian Islands stirred awake under a rising sun. For most Americans stationed at Pearl Harbor, it was another Sunday morning of routine duties and slow beginnings. But inside a small, scarcely noticed outpost perched on Oahu's northern tip, two young Army privates stared at a glowing screen. Puzzled by the signals it displayed, their station housed one of the newly installed radar sets, an experimental tool meant to provide early warning of incoming aircraft. What they saw that morning would become one of war's most haunting what-ifs. The men had switched on radar just after dawn. They quickly detected a massive formation approaching from the north. The echo was strong, undeniable. Dozens upon dozens of blips stretched across the scope. Startled, they contacted the command center to report their findings. The response was dismissive. A senior officer, unfamiliar with radar's implications, assumed the reading was nothing unusual. A flight of incoming American bombers expected from California. "Don't worry about it," he said. With that, the warning was ignored. Hours later, Japanese aircraft thundered down upon Pearl Harbor, one of history's most infamous surprise attacks. Battleships burned, airfields erupted in flames. The United States was hurled into global war. The irony was cruel. America had glimpsed the Japanese fleet before it struck, thanks to radar. But the technology was so new, the human system around it so unprepared, that opportunity slipped through their fingers. The Japanese had no idea they'd brushed against America's invisible shield. This episode underscored both radar's promise and its limitations. Machines could see the invisible, but only if those in command trusted the vision. In December 1941, radar was still treated as curiosity, an experimental supplement rather than decisive instrument. Officers trained in traditional reconnaissance methods couldn't comprehend that blurry lines on screens might mean life or death. The awakening. For the Japanese, their strike confirmed belief that surprise was still possible. They didn't grasp that Americans had been only one decision away from spoiling the attack. In Tokyo, news of Pearl Harbor's success brought jubilation. Admirals and generals congratulated themselves on flawless execution. Pilots returned as heroes, boasting that Americans had been caught utterly blind. The Japanese High Command saw confirmation of their doctrine. Speed, precision, and secrecy had carried the day. Yet beneath their triumph lay hidden truth. America possessed tools capable of glimpsing their fleet before it struck. Those tools would only grow sharper as war dragged on. The Pearl Harbor radar incident became a lesson for both sides. For Americans, it revealed that technology alone wasn't enough. Procedures, training, and belief had to catch up. Machines could provide early warning, but unless commanders acted, opportunity was lost. For the Japanese, ignorance of radar's presence reinforced complacency. They assumed Americans had been completely blind, never suspecting that new vision had almost undone their perfect surprise. In weeks that followed, U.S. officers pored over attack details, the ignored radar signal. Anger, regret, and determination spread through ranks. The failure to act wasn't forgotten. Slowly, radar shifted from novelty to necessity. Stations were upgraded. Operators trained more rigorously. Commanders began realizing that glowing echoes on screens might prove more reliable than the sharpest lookout on a ship's mast. The tide begins to turn. For the Japanese, war after Pearl Harbor continued with momentum. Conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and Dutch East Indies unfolded swiftly. But seeds of change had already been sown. Radar had been present at Pearl Harbor. Though ignored, it had revealed its potential. The day would come when Japanese pilots would fly into storms of gunfire, from defenders who seemed to know exactly where they were, long before human eyes could possibly see them. That morning on Oahu had been the first glimpse of warfare's new age, one where surprise would no longer belong solely to the daring and bold, but to those who mastered the invisible. The months following Pearl Harbor carried the Japanese Empire to its greatest territorial reach. Swift victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific seemed to confirm their belief: the supremacy of speed and surprise. Yet as war unfolded, balance began shifting, often in ways that left Japanese pilots and commanders baffled. At battles like Midway and later Guadalcanal, they encountered something confounding: American defenders who seemed prepared in advance, as if guided by an unseen hand. That unseen hand was radar, steadily maturing into a decisive weapon. The shock at Midway. At Midway in June 1942, Japanese carrier forces sailed with confidence, expecting to deliver a crushing blow that would eliminate America's remaining naval power. Their plan hinged, as always, on surprise. But American codebreakers and radar operators worked in tandem, feeding U.S. commanders information that blunted Japanese tactics. Radar stations on Midway Island detected incoming raids early, giving defenders precious minutes to scramble fighters and ready anti-aircraft guns. Japanese pilots, who believed they approached undetected under cover of distance and cloud, were stunned to meet prepared opposition. The battle turned into disaster for Japan. 4 carriers lost. Though code-breaking played a central role, radar's contribution was a harbinger of future shocks, alerting defenders before attackers could strike. Night becomes the enemy. Later at Guadalcanal, radar's significance became even clearer. The Solomon Islands campaign was brutal attrition, fought in jungle airstrips, on turbulent seas, under cover of night. Japanese air crews repeatedly launched raids against Henderson Field, expecting to catch American planes on the ground. Instead, radar units on the island routinely spotted them coming. American defenders scrambled aircraft in time to meet raids head-on. To Japanese pilots, it seemed uncanny. How could the enemy always be ready? Their carefully timed night approaches, designed to exploit darkness, were foiled again and again. Even more unnerving were naval engagements. Traditionally, night battles favored the Japanese. Their crews were trained for nocturnal operations. Ships carried deadly torpedoes designed for surprise strikes under darkness cover. In earlier clashes, this gave them the edge. But as U.S. warships began carrying radar, tables turned. American destroyers and cruisers could track Japanese vessels long before visual contact. In chaotic nighttime melees, radar-directed gunfire struck targets that Japanese officers hadn't even glimpsed. Suddenly, night's cloak no longer guaranteed safety. The psychological breaking point. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots trained to exploit weather and darkness now faced an enemy who seemed to pierce both. Reports filtered back from the front. American fighters intercepting raids through heavy cloud banks. Anti-aircraft fire opening with uncanny accuracy. Surface ships maneuvering with precision in total blackness. To many Japanese ranks, it seemed Americans possessed supernatural senses. Few understood radar's true mechanics. Rumors spread that the enemy had developed strange new detection methods, perhaps using invisible light or mysterious listening devices. The transformation of naval warfare reached its most dramatic expression at night. For centuries, darkness had cloaked fleets and concealed movements. The Imperial Japanese Navy, more than any other, embraced night as ally. Their doctrine emphasized surprise torpedo attacks under darkness cover. Sailors were rigorously trained in nocturnal navigation and gunnery. Throughout early war months, this specialization allowed them to outfight American ships in several night clashes. But by late 1942 and into 1943, a silent revolution was underway. American vessels began arriving equipped with radar sets that could see through blackness, turning night into a killing ground where Japan's advantage dissolved. Guadalcanal's deadly waters. The waters off Guadalcanal became the proving ground for this shift. At first, Japanese destroyers and cruisers executed daring night raids, slipping close to American positions and launching deadly long-lance torpedoes with devastating effect. Yet gradually, U.S. warships began responding differently. Instead of being caught unaware, they maneuvered as if guided by some unseen map. Radar operators below deck traced arcs of light across scopes, marking enemy vessel positions long before lookouts could see them. Commanders issued precise orders based not on flares or searchlights, but on steady reports of invisible signals. The effect in battle was stunning. In the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, radar-equipped American ships opened fire on Japanese vessels before the Japanese knew they'd been spotted. Guns roared into night, striking targets invisible to naked eye. Japanese officers were bewildered, forced to fight blind against an enemy with otherworldly directional sense. What had been their domain, the night sea, was turning against them. For sailors and pilots accustomed to darkness as shield, the realization was unnerving. Stories circulated of American ships firing accurately without illumination, of destroyers steering directly toward Japanese formations hidden by distance and night. Pilots reported approaching targets only to be met by anti-aircraft fire the moment they drew near, as if their arrival had been anticipated down to the minute. In whispered conversations, some Japanese speculated about sorcery or secret listening devices. Few understood radar's true power. America masters the dark. Americans, meanwhile, refined the art of radar-directed combat. Special roles emerged aboard ships: radar plotters, fighter directors, control officers who translated glowing arcs into actionable commands. The bridge of a U.S. cruiser in night battle became a hive of activity. Commanders relied less on their own eyes and more on calm voices relaying bearings and distances from radar rooms below. With each engagement, their confidence grew. Darkness was no longer an enemy. It had become a partner. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. American sailors who once dreaded night encounters began welcoming them. Knowing their technology gave decisive edge. Japanese forces, conversely, grew increasingly anxious. What had been a point of pride, their night-fighting skill, now became a source of dread. Officers reported higher stress among crews who feared the unseen reach of radar-guided gunnery. The very environment they'd mastered was slipping from their control. The shift also extended to skies. By 1943, radar-equipped American night fighters were intercepting Japanese bombers under darkness cover. Ground-based radar stations guided them directly to targets, allowing ambush of bombers that believed themselves invisible. The Japanese, relying on outdated navigation and detection methods, were left confused as squadrons vanished into night, never to return. Once again, what had been their trusted ally, night's concealment, now betrayed them. Tokyo's growing alarm. In Tokyo, reports from the front grew increasingly alarming. Admirals and commanders began acknowledging that Americans possessed some form of advanced detection. This was robbing Japan of one of its most cherished advantages. Yet attempts to counter this technology lagged behind. Japan's industrial base was strained. Resources were scarce. The expertise needed to replicate American radar was limited. As a result, the gap widened. With each night battle, Japanese forces paid the price. The mastery of radar during nocturnal clashes marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It wasn't merely a matter of machines, but of perception itself. To the Japanese, Americans seemed to have stolen the night from them, transforming it into a battlefield where hunter became hunted. Each new encounter reinforced the sense that something invisible, something relentless, was watching them. And as war dragged on, that invisible watcher only grew stronger. The web expands. By 1943, radar had expanded beyond a defensive tool into a force that reshaped how the United States waged war across the Pacific. What had begun as bulky experimental sets on a handful of ships now evolved into a vast network of eyes, stretching across thousands of miles. Americans had learned to use radar not only to defend against sudden raids, but also to guide their own offensives, reaching deep into waters and skies once considered unknowable. For Japanese forces, it was as if their enemy had acquired a sixth sense, extending vision far beyond the horizon. One of the most transformative applications was in the fight against submarines. Japanese commanders had long relied on stealthy undersea craft to harass American shipping and scout enemy positions. But as radar-equipped patrol planes and escort ships multiplied, submarines found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Radar could detect the faint silhouette of a periscope slicing through waves, or catch a sub as it surfaced to recharge batteries under night cover. Aircraft that once would have flown blindly over open ocean were now guided by radar to exact locations, dropping depth charges with deadly accuracy. For Japanese submarine crews, the ocean's vastness no longer promised safety. Equally important was the guidance radar provided to bombers. Long-range missions over the Pacific involved hours of flying across featureless seas. Even slight navigation errors could mean disaster. Radar navigation solved this problem. American bombers fitted with radar could locate islands hidden in cloud or darkness, charting precise courses that brought them to targets. As technology matured, radar also enabled blind bombing through overcast skies, allowing attacks even when visibility was near zero. Japanese defenders, who once counted on weather to shield their airfields and convoys, suddenly found clouds offered no protection. Orchestrating victory. The cumulative effect was that American commanders could coordinate operations with precision the Japanese never anticipated. Fighter directors used radar data to orchestrate aerial battles, vectoring squadrons toward enemy formations beyond visual range. Convoys moved under watchful guard of escort carriers whose radar detected incoming threats long before they appeared on horizon. Even amphibious landings, like those at Tarawa and later the Marianas, were guided and shielded by radar networks. These knitted together fleets, aircraft, and shore installations into a single web of awareness. For Japanese aviators, the experience was disorienting. Pilots accustomed to striking from nowhere now found themselves intercepted far from targets. Convoys they thought hidden were met by swarms of American planes, seemingly conjured from thin air. Reports circulated of Japanese formations detected and destroyed before they ever glimpsed opponents. It seemed Americans no longer relied on luck or chance. They simply knew. The radar advantage also reshaped strategy at highest levels. Admirals who once agonized over ambush risk began planning bold thrusts deep into enemy territory, confident that radar coverage would reveal threats in time. American ships sailed into contested waters with growing assurance, while Japanese fleets shrank back, increasingly wary of unseen detection. The initiative in the Pacific, once Japan's, shifted inexorably to the United States. Perhaps most striking was the change in perception among ordinary sailors and airmen. Radar became an unseen comrade, a constant companion whose quiet pulses provided reassurance in darkest hours. Men who might once have felt blind and vulnerable at night now trusted the voices of radar operators guiding them. This trust built morale and reinforced belief that technology itself was tilting war in their favor. For the Japanese, the opposite occurred. Confidence eroded as they faced an enemy whose awareness seemed supernatural. Japan's desperate scramble. By the middle of 1943, Japanese commanders could no longer deny that Americans had developed technology that fundamentally altered war's nature. Reports from every front told the same story. Raids intercepted in total darkness. Bombers shredded before reaching targets. Surface ships outmaneuvered at night by opponents who seemed to know their exact positions. The truth was dawning on Tokyo. Radar was real, powerful, and devastating. Yet acknowledgement didn't guarantee salvation. Japan's attempts to catch up were plagued by delay, scarcity, and confusion. Japanese scientists hadn't been wholly ignorant of radar's potential. As early as the late 1930s, researchers in Japan experimented with radio detection. By 1941, they'd developed primitive sets capable of detecting aircraft. But unlike the United States or Britain, Japan lacked the industrial base to mass-produce these devices quickly. Worse, the military hierarchy had been slow to prioritize radar, dismissing it as secondary to carriers, aircraft, and submarines. When war began, radar research was still a backwater, starved of funding and attention. Once the scale of America's radar advantage became undeniable, Japan scrambled to respond. Laboratories worked to refine prototypes. Small numbers of sets were installed on warships or positioned along coasts. Yet the equipment was crude and often unreliable. Japanese radar lacked the range and resolution of American systems. Frequent breakdowns frustrated operators. Training was another obstacle. Radar required skilled technicians to interpret echoes and guide forces. But Japan couldn't spare the time or manpower to cultivate such specialists. Many operators were rushed into service with minimal preparation, leading to misinterpretations and wasted opportunities. Field commanders, too, struggled with trust. Accustomed to relying on human lookouts and seasoned aviator instincts, they often doubted the strange signals delivered by new machines. In some cases, radar warnings were ignored or misread, echoing the very mistakes Americans had made at Pearl Harbor. But while the United States corrected those errors swiftly, Japan lacked both infrastructure and confidence to institutionalize radar as defense centerpiece. Meanwhile, American radar grew more advanced with each passing month. Sets became smaller, more powerful, more accurate. They appeared not just on battleships and carriers, but also on destroyers, submarines, and even individual aircraft. The gap widened relentlessly. The technological abyss. Japanese engineers tried to bridge it, but shortages of critical materials crippled production. High-quality vacuum tubes were scarce. Bombing raids on Japanese industry further hampered efforts, scattering research and destroying precious facilities. Captured examples of American radar shocked Japanese scientists. When they examined downed aircraft or salvaged wreckage, they found components far more sophisticated than their own. It was clear the enemy had invested vast resources and talent into perfecting the technology. Yet by then, Japan's ability to respond was strangled by dwindling resources, overstretched supply lines, and a war already slipping away. The frustration of Japanese aviators was palpable. They flew missions under assumptions of stealth, only to be met by interceptors guided unerringly to their positions. They attempted night strikes only to be ambushed before reaching objectives. For a culture that prized surprise and precision, it was humiliating. Pilots began speaking openly of an enemy who fought with eyes in the dark. The mystique of Japanese invincibility, cultivated so carefully in pre-war years, was eroding in the face of this invisible opponent. In Tokyo, debates raged within high command. Some argued for a crash program to develop and deploy radar widely. Others insisted resources must remain concentrated on aircraft production and defensive fortifications. The compromise that emerged pleased no one. Radar development continued, but at a pace too slow to change war's course. By the time modest networks of Japanese radar stations dotted the home islands, the American advance had already swept across the Pacific, tightening its grip. The futility of Japan's radar race became increasingly clear. For every handful of sets they managed to install, Americans deployed hundreds. For every operator Japan trained, the U.S. trained dozens, supported by standardized procedures and vast logistical networks. The technological contest was hopelessly one-sided. What remained for Japan was to endure, to fight with courage and skill against an enemy who could see them before they even realized they'd been spotted. Thus, Japan's attempts to catch up were not only a technical failure, but also symbolic. They revealed the deeper weakness of a nation stretched beyond capacity, wedded to doctrines that had been overtaken by science. Radar wasn't merely another weapon. It was a revolution in perception. By the time Japan tried to embrace it, the revolution had already passed them by. The final demonstration, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, revealed this gulf with merciless clarity. Japanese commanders assembled what remained of their carrier force in desperate attempt to halt American advance. Hundreds of planes were launched, but Americans intercepted nearly all of them long before they reached targets. Radar stations aboard U.S. carriers and escort ships detected Japanese formations from vast distances, vectoring American fighters into position. What followed was massacre, so one-sided it became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many poorly trained by this stage of war, were slaughtered in waves. Survivors described the horrifying sensation of being met by swarms of American fighters that appeared as if summoned from nowhere. In truth, they'd been directed by radar with chilling precision. As the U.S. advanced closer to Japan's home islands, radar's dominance only deepened. Bombers unleashed devastation on Japanese cities by night and day, often through heavy cloud cover. Radar-guided navigation and bombing meant weather no longer provided safety. Raids that might once have been thwarted by storms arrived unerringly at targets. Japanese defenders, starved of fuel and aircraft, scrambled desperately, but could rarely intercept. When they did, American radar-directed fighters intercepted them swiftly, cutting them down before they could inflict serious damage. Perhaps the most striking demonstration came in battles surrounding Okinawa in 1945. Japan deployed waves of kamikaze aircraft in last-ditch attempt to stem invasion. These suicide planes depended on surprise element, diving suddenly from clouds or over horizon. But the U.S. fleet was girded with radar picket ships, destroyers stationed in advance of main fleet, their radar screens scanning skies continuously. Alerts rippled through fleet, vectoring fighters toward kamikaze and directing anti-aircraft guns to waiting positions. Though losses were still heavy, without radar, devastation would have been far worse. For Japanese pilots, it was another cruel revelation. Even their final weapon of desperation could be blunted by enemies' invisible eyes. The reckoning. In Tokyo, officers who survived the war later admitted their astonishment. They described radar as the unseen adversary that had broken their confidence. One naval commander confessed that it was radar, more than America's overwhelming industry, that rendered traditional Japanese tactics useless. Surprise had been their doctrine's cornerstone. Radar had torn it away. Others reflected on their nation's failure to prioritize such technology earlier, lamenting the arrogance that had led them to underestimate machines' value over spirit. The legacy of radar extended beyond the battlefield. It marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one where information and detection proved as decisive as firepower. The Japanese, stunned by what radar had accomplished, would later study it carefully during post-war years, integrating its lessons into their own defense planning. For the United States, radar had not only helped win the war, but also shaped the technological trajectory of the coming Cold War, where invisible detection and surveillance would define strategy. Looking back, the astonishment of Japanese officers was understandable. They'd entered the conflict believing courage, training, and surprise would guarantee victory. They left it having witnessed how invisible signals, pulsing silently through the ether, could overturn centuries of naval tradition. Radar had been America's secret weapon of perception, a machine that allowed them to see the invisible. And in the end, it was this vision, relentless, tireless, and inescapable, that ensured Japan could no longer fight in darkness or strike unseen. The Pacific War had become a contest between two philosophies, one rooted in warrior traditions and human spirit, the other embracing a future where machines extended human perception into realms previously unknown. When the smoke cleared, the machines had won. But that victory came at a cost of innocence. War would never again be a purely human endeavor. The age of electronic warfare had begun. And in those glowing radar screens, pulsing with invisible light, lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The future belonged to those who could master the invisible frequencies, who could see beyond the horizon, through clouds, across vast distances. The Japanese had learned this lesson too late, but they would never forget it.